The farm had always been a place of peace for me. I had taken it over years ago after my father passed, and though it was hard work, it gave me a sense of purpose. Day in and day out, I tended to the crops, fed the animals, and maintained the land. There was something about the rhythm of farm life that kept me grounded, even when the world outside felt chaotic. But on that particular day, as I stood beneath the sweltering summer sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. My nephew, Albert, had been staying with me for the summer. His parents thought he needed some time away from the city, and I agreed that the fresh air and hard work would be good for him. He had just turned 23, a tall, strong young man who was full of energy. At first, I thought he'd be bored by the quiet of the countryside, but he took to the farm life surprisingly well. He had spent the past few weeks helping me with everything, fixing fences, herding cattle, mending the barn roof, and I had to admit, his presence had been a welcome change. There was something about having someone else around that made the long days feel a little less lonely. But lately, there had been something else in the air between us, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't just the way Albert had taken to the farm or how easily he adapted to the work. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. I would catch him staring when he thought I wasn't paying attention, and I would feel my pulse quicken, though I wasn't sure why. It wasn't until that afternoon, when the sun was high in the sky and we were working in the barn, that things started to shift in a way I hadn't expected. We were moving hay bales, the heavy work making us both sweat in the summer heat. Albert's shirt clung to his chest, his muscles flexing with every movement, and I found myself stealing glances at him, watching the way his body moved. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the heat getting to me, but there was something about him, about the way he carried himself, that I couldn't ignore. "You okay, Uncle Ben?" Albert's voice broke through my thoughts, and I turned to find him standing there, watching me with a concerned expression. "You look like you're lost in thought." I wiped the sweat from my brow and gave him a half smile. "Just thinking about the work we've got left to do," I lied, though the truth was far more complicated than I was willing to admit. Albert grinned, his usual easygoing demeanor back in place. "Don't worry about it, we'll knock it out in no time." I nodded, grateful for the distraction of work. But as we continued to move the hay bales, the silence between us grew heavy again, and I could feel the tension building. It was as if the air around us had thickened, charged with something unspoken, and I didn't know how to break it. After an hour or so, we stopped for a break. Albert leaned against the side of the barn, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. I sat on a bale of hay, trying to ignore the way my heart raced in my chest. "You've been quiet lately," Albert said after a moment, his voice softer now, as if he was testing the waters. I shrugged, not sure how to respond. "Just got a lot on my mind." Albert nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes that told me he wasn't convinced. "I've noticed," he said, stepping closer. "It's like, I don't know, like something's changed." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean?" Albert hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know. It just feels like there's been something between us lately. Something neither of us is talking about." My heart skipped a beat at his words, and I felt the tension between us spike. I tried to brush it off, to laugh it away, but the look in his eyes told me that this wasn't something I could just ignore. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though even I didn't believe the words. But Albert didn't back down. He stepped closer still, his presence overwhelming in the small space of the barn. "You know what I'm talking about, Uncle Ben." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was stare at him, my mind racing with the possibilities of what he might say next. But I already knew. Deep down, I had known for a while. "I've been feeling it too," Albert said softly, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I don't know how to explain it, but I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was my nephew, my sister's son, and yet the way he was looking at me now, the way his body was so close to mine, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. "Albert," I started to say, but my voice faltered. He reached out then, his hand brushing lightly against mine, and the simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as he took another step closer. Before I could say anything, before I could even process what was happening, Albert leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine in a tentative, almost hesitant kiss. It was brief, over in a heartbeat, but it was enough to set my whole body on fire. I pulled back, my mind racing, but Albert didn't let me go far. He reached for my hand again, holding it firmly as he looked into my eyes. "I've wanted this for a long time," he confessed, his voice full of emotion. "I didn't think you felt the same. But now I'm not so sure." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and desire. How had we gotten here? How had something so impossible suddenly become real? "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice shaky. "You don't have to say anything," Albert said softly, his hand still holding mine. "Just don't push me away." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. This was wrong. It was complicated, but the way he was looking at me, the way his touch sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't find it in myself to push him away. The air in the barn was thick with tension, the kind that felt electric, charged with something neither of us could quite name. I couldn't believe this was happening. My nephew standing so close, his hand still holding mine, his eyes full of something that had been hidden between us for far too long. It was wrong, but at the same time, it felt inevitable. We stood there, the silence stretching out, neither of us knowing what to say. The reality of what had just happened, that brief kiss, weighed heavily in the air between us. I should have pulled away, should have put some distance between us. But I didn't. I couldn't. Albert's grip on my hand tightened slightly, his thumb brushing over my skin in a way that sent another jolt of electricity through me. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough to make my breath hitch in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him, couldn't bring myself to move. "Uncle Ben," Albert said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I know this is unexpected. I know it's complicated, but I can't help how I feel." I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. "Albert, we can't," I started. He shook his head, his gaze never leaving mine. "Why not? Why do we have to keep pretending there's nothing between us?" "Because," I started to say, but the words got stuck in my throat. Because he was my nephew? Because this wasn't supposed to happen? But those reasons felt hollow now, flimsy against the intensity of the moment. "Because it's wrong," I whispered, though even I didn't believe it anymore. Albert's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his body so close to mine that I could feel the heat radiating off him. "It doesn't feel wrong to me," he murmured, his hand still holding mine. "It feels like the most natural thing in the world." His words made my heart race, and I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in years, desire. Raw and undeniable. I knew I should stop this before it went any further. But I couldn't bring myself to push him away. "I've thought about this for a long time," Albert continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "About you. About us." His confession sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my resolve weakening. This was my nephew, but in that moment, he didn't feel like family. He felt like something more. Something I had been ignoring for too long. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand brushing against his cheek. His skin was warm, smooth under my fingertips, and the contact sent another surge of heat through me. Albert closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into my touch, and the intimacy of the gesture made my chest tighten with emotions I couldn't quite name. When he opened his eyes again, there was a fire there, a desire that mirrored my own. "I don't want to pretend anymore," he whispered, his voice full of longing. "I want you, Uncle Ben." The words hit me like a freight train, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was no more hiding from this, no more pretending. The connection between us was real, and it had been building for longer than I wanted to admit. "Albert," I said quietly, my voice shaky, "it's complicated." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, but we don't have to figure everything out right now. We can just be here together." His hand slipped from mine, moving to rest lightly on my waist, and I felt a wave of heat rush through me at the simple touch. My mind was racing, my body responding in ways I hadn't expected, but all I could focus on was him, on the way his body felt against mine, the way his eyes were searching mine for some kind of answer. And in that moment, I realized I didn't want to fight it anymore. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips finding his in a kiss that was tentative at first, as if I was testing the waters. But the moment our lips touched, everything changed. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, and I felt Albert's arms wrap around me. pulling me closer to him. The world seemed to fall away as we kissed. The only sound the soft rustle of hay beneath our feet and the distant call of birds outside the barn. His lips were soft, warm, and I felt myself melting into him. All the tension that had been building between us finally breaking free. His hands moved up my back, pulling me even closer, and I couldn't help but respond to the heat of his touch. My fingers tangled in his hair, and I kissed him back with a hunger I hadn't known I still had. It was like something had been unlocked inside me, something I hadn't realized was there, and now that it had been released, there was no going back. But the story didn't end here. We broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind still reeling from what had just happened, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. There was no guilt, no shame, just the raw intensity of what we had just shared. "I don't want to stop," Albert whispered, his voice full of emotion. I looked into his eyes, my heart racing. "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely audible. Albert smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "Then we won't." He kissed me again, softer this time, but no less intense. His hands moved to cup my face, holding me gently as his lips moved against mine. There was a tenderness there now, a softness that made my chest ache with emotions I wasn't ready to name. I kissed him back, my hands sliding up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady thump of his heartbeat beneath my fingers. The connection between us was undeniable now, and I didn't want to fight it anymore. I didn't want to push him away. As the minutes passed, the urgency between us began to fade, replaced by a quiet intimacy that made the world outside the barn feel distant and unimportant. We stood there, wrapped up in each other, the warmth of his body grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. Eventually, we pulled apart, both of us breathless but smiling. Albert rested his forehead against mine, his hands still cradling my face. And for the first time, everything felt right. Complicated, yes, but right. "I don't know what this means," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. Albert smiled, his thumb brushing lightly over my cheek. "It means we're not alone anymore." The simplicity of his words made my heart swell with emotion, and I couldn't help but smile back. He was right. Whatever this was, whatever came next, we would figure it out together. The next few days on the farm were surreal. The tension between Albert and me had shifted, but the weight of what had happened in the barn still lingered in the air. Everything felt different, charged with an unspoken connection that neither of us could deny anymore. It was as though the barn had become our secret, a place where everything that was complicated and confusing could just be. We didn't talk about it right away. Instead, we kept working side by side, tending to the animals, fixing fences, and completing all the daily tasks that came with farm life. But every now and then, I'd catch Albert looking at me out of the corner of his eye, and my heart would race all over again. It was a silent acknowledgement of what had happened between us, a reminder that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. One afternoon, we were working by the field near the old oak tree that had stood on the farm for generations. The sun was hot, and sweat dripped down the back of my neck as I lifted another bale of hay onto the tractor. Albert was beside me, his shirt clinging to his chest as he worked. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept wandering back to that moment in the barn. The way his lips had felt against mine, the way his touch had made my skin tingle. As we finished up, Albert wiped the sweat from his forehead and glanced over at me. A small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've been quiet," he said, echoing the same words he had said in the barn just days before. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Just thinking about us?" he asked, his voice soft but full of intent. I froze, my heart skipping a beat at the directness of his question. There was no point in lying. He already knew the answer. "Yeah," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Albert nodded, his eyes searching mine. "Me too." We stood there for a moment, the tension between us palpable, as if the air itself was buzzing with everything we weren't saying. I didn't know how to move forward, how to bridge the gap between what we had done and what it meant for us. But I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to let go of whatever this was. I didn't want to lose him. And then it happened. Albert stepped closer, his presence warm and steady, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. He was watching me carefully, as if he was trying to figure out what came next. just like I was. His hand reached out, brushing lightly against mine, and the simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through me all over again. "I don't know what this is," Albert said softly, his voice laced with uncertainty. "But I know I don't want to stop." My breath caught in my throat, and I looked up at him, my mind spinning. This was my nephew, my family, but the connection we shared felt deeper than blood. It felt like something that had been waiting to happen, like we had been drawn together by something neither of us could explain. "I don't want to stop either," I confessed, my voice trembling slightly. Albert's eyes softened, and he stepped even closer, his hand moving to rest lightly on my waist. The heat between us was undeniable, and I could feel my body responding to his touch in ways I hadn't expected. My pulse quickened, and I felt the familiar rush of desire coursing through me. "I've been thinking about you every day," Albert continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ever since that day in the barn. I can't stop thinking about what it meant. About us." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's complicated, I know," he said, his thumb brushing gently over my side. "But that doesn't mean it's wrong." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I knew he was right. This wasn't something we had planned or even imagined, but it felt right, even in its complexity. The way he touched me, the way he looked at me, it made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I reached up, my hand cupping the side of his face. And for a moment, we just stood there, our eyes locked, the world around us fading into the background. There was no confusion now, no uncertainty, just him and me, and the quiet intensity of the moment we were sharing. "I don't know where this leads," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the emotions swirling inside me. "But I don't want to lose you." Albert leaned into my touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment before he opened them again, full of the same desire I had seen in the barn. "You won't lose me," he murmured. "Not now, not ever." The promise in his words made my chest tighten, and I felt a surge of emotion rise up inside me. I didn't want to let him go. I didn't want to lose what we had found, even if it was complicated, even if it was messy. "I'm yours," Albert whispered, his voice full of emotion. "If you'll have me." My heart swelled at his words, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, full of the intensity of everything we had been holding back. His hands moved up to cup my face, holding me gently as he kissed me back, his lips warm and soft against mine. The kiss deepened, slow and sensual, and I felt my body melt into his as he pulled me closer. There was no urgency this time, no rush, just the quiet intimacy of two people who had finally stopped pretending. Every touch, every brush of his lips against mine, felt like a promise, like a confession of everything we hadn't said out loud. We pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. My heart was pounding in my chest, but it wasn't with fear or uncertainty anymore. It was with the realization that we had found something real, something worth holding on to. "I don't want this to be just a moment," Albert said softly, his voice full of emotion. "I want this to be more." His words echoed the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind for days. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction or a passing moment. This was something deeper, something that had been growing between us for longer than either of us had realized. "I want that too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Albert smiled, his eyes bright with hope. "Then let's make it more." As we stood there wrapped up in each other, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the fields. The world felt softer, quieter, as if time had slowed down just for us. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced before. There was an unspoken understanding between Albert and me now, something that didn't need to be defined by words but was always there, simmering beneath the surface. Every moment we spent together, whether it was working on the farm, eating dinner, or just sitting on the porch watching the sun go down, was charged with a quiet intensity. It was as though the air itself had shifted, wrapping us in a cocoon of understanding, desire, and something else that neither of us could yet name. But then something changed. One evening, after another long day of work, Albert and I found ourselves sitting on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was warm, a soft breeze rustling through the tall grass, and the sounds of the farm settling in for the night filled the space between us. I glanced over at Albert, who was leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the sunset, a peaceful expression on his face. "I can't believe how beautiful it is here," he said quietly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I never really appreciated it before." I nodded, my heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "It's always been like this. You just had to stop long enough to see it." Albert turned to look at me, his eyes soft, full of something that made my chest tighten. "I think I've been missing a lot of things," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his words hung between us, and I felt the familiar tension building again, that pull that had become impossible to ignore. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to put into words the way I was feeling. So I just stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch out unbroken. And the story didn't end there. After a few moments, Albert stood up, walking over to the railing and leaning against it as he looked out over the fields. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed him in warm light, and I couldn't help but admire the way he looked, so strong, so sure of himself, yet still carrying that vulnerability that had drawn me to him in the first place. I stood up too, joining him at the railing, and we stood there in silence for a moment, side by side. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet understanding that we didn't need to force anything. Whatever was between us, it would unfold in its own time. "I've been thinking about what you said," Albert murmured after a while, his eyes still focused on the horizon. I turned to look at him, my heart racing. "What did I say?" "That you don't want to lose me," he said softly, his voice full of emotion. "And I don't want to lose you either. I don't want to lose what we found." His words hit me hard, and I felt a rush of emotion rise up inside me. This was real, this was happening, and I didn't want to run from it anymore. "You won't lose me," I said quietly, reaching out to rest my hand on his arm. "I'm not going anywhere." Albert turned to face me, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment, it felt like everything else fell away. The farm, the sunset, the world around us, it all faded into the background, leaving just the two of us standing there with the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on us. Without another word, Albert closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was slow and tender, full of all the emotions we had been holding back for so long. His hands moved to cup my face, holding me gently as he kissed me, and I felt myself melt into him, all the tension and uncertainty slipping away. The kiss deepened, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me closer, as our bodies pressed together. There was no hesitation now. No second guessing. This was what we both wanted, what we had been moving toward for so long, and it felt right in a way that nothing else ever had. My hand slid up to his shoulders, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers, and I kissed him back with a hunger I hadn't realized I still had. Every touch, every movement, felt like a promise, like we were finally letting go of everything that had been holding us back. We pulled apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. My heart was racing, but it wasn't with fear or doubt anymore. It was with the realization that we had found something real, something worth holding on to. "I don't want to hide this," Albert whispered, his voice full of emotion. "I don't want to pretend anymore." His words echoed the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind for days. This wasn't something we could ignore, and I didn't want to. The connection between us was undeniable, and it had been growing for far longer than either of us had realized. "Me neither," I said softly, my voice trembling with the weight of the emotions swirling inside me. "I want this, Albert, I want you." The look in his eyes was enough to take my breath away. He smiled, a soft, genuine smile that made my chest tighten with emotion, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in soft shadows, Albert leaned in and kissed me again, softer this time, but no less full of promise. His hands moved to rest on my hips, pulling me closer, and I felt the familiar rush of desire course through me. We stood there, wrapped up in each other, the world around us fading into the background as we let ourselves get lost in the moment. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet, steady beat of our hearts as we held each other close, knowing that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments, quiet touches, and whispered confessions. Every glance, Every brush of his hand against mine felt charged with the weight of everything we had shared, and I found myself looking forward to the simple moments when we could just be together. But the story didn't end here. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set once again, Albert reached over and took my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. I looked over at him, my heart swelling with the realization that this was real, that we had found something worth holding on to. "I love you," Albert said softly, his voice full of emotion. The words hit me like a tidal wave, and I felt tears well up in my eyes. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words until they were spoken. And I knew in that moment that I felt the same. "I love you too," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the emotions swirling inside me. Albert smiled, his eyes bright with happiness, and he leaned in to kiss me again, his lips soft and warm against mine. The world outside the farm seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us wrapped up in each other, knowing that we had found something rare and beautiful. As we sat there holding hands, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. We had found something special, something worth fighting for, and no matter what came next, we would stand side by side, ready to take on whatever challenges came our way. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone. I had found love again. Unexpected, complicated, but real, and that was all that mattered.